This is the Bible Book Club podcast.
The book of Ezra.
Welcome to the club.
Last time in chapters 1 and 2 of Ezra, it's the story of how God stirred the hearts of his people to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple in the face of fierce opposition. The return took place in 3 waves. The first wave of exiles to return was led by Zerubbabel, a descendant of David. The second by Ezra. The last by Nehemiah. And that will be covered in the book of Nehemiah. God provided everything for his people to return to the promised land. He provided the permission the exiles needed from the king, Cyrus. He provided the people to make the move, and he provided the provisions they needed to survive during and after the journey. The return, or the Exodus, had been foretold down to the name of the king by Jeremiah and Isaiah decades before it happened. To summarize, the return was all God.
In this episode, we're exploring that very first wave or return of exiles, a return that Ezra documented but was not a part of. The scene opens with 2 key figures, Zerubbabel and Joshua. Now, Zerubbabel was the grandson of the last king of Judah, Jehoiachin. So if God is going to make anyone a king, Zerubbabel's descendants would qualify for the position according to the Davidic covenant. We know he's not going to make anyone king, but if he did, Zerubbabel, the leader by birth, is accompanied by Joshua, a priest. Now, Joshua is the son of Jozadak. His ancestry is traced in 1 Chronicles 6 by Ezra. His lineage is important because the high priest must be a descendant of Aaron. Joshua meets the criteria and will be the 24th high priest. The point is that the Israelites have everything they need to start again. The seed promised from the Davidic covenant in Zerubbabel, and Joshua, a high priest, to lead them back to the Mosaic covenant. Scene 1. The rebuild begins with the altar.
Ezra, chapter 3. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one in Jerusalem. Then Joshua, son of Jozadak, and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build the altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what was written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices.
So let's talk about why the altar was built even before the temple was built. Building the altar was crucial to the Israelites' relationship with God. The practice of building an altar began with the Israelites' forefathers. Noah's first act upon landing the ark was to build an altar and offer sacrifices in Genesis 8. And Abraham built an altar when he arrived in the land and was told by God it would be given to his descendants in Genesis 12. Jacob did the same in Genesis 33. These altars were for worshiping and thanksgiving. It was Moses who wrote the book of the law, the purpose of sacrifice, and built the bronze altar for the tabernacle. So now we're kind of switching the purpose of the altar. It was Solomon who supersized that altar for the temple. And here we are hundreds of years later, Zerubbabel and Joshua are laying the groundwork to renew Israel's covenant with God by building the altar again. Why? Why was the altar so important? One word, atonement. Sacrifices on the altar were the only way sins could be forgiven or atoned for. And sin was what stood between them and a relationship with God. We'll include a chart from season 3 Leviticus that details all the sacrifices in the show notes so you can check them out because there were lots of different kinds that happened on that altar. The purpose of the altar and the shedding of blood is best explained by Paul in the book of Hebrews.
Hebrews 9:22. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness.
For us today, the old law of cleansing sin with blood has been replaced with a new covenant.
Hebrews chapter 9, starting in verse 11. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, is not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once and for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who were ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciousness from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant.
Thank God for the new covenant. The exiles needed 3 things for their relationship with God. They had to have an altar for the forgiveness of sins. They had to have a high priest from the line of Aaron to perform the sacrifices. And they had to have that promised seed of a king, the future Messiah, from the line of David. For our relationship with God, it was all rolled into one man. We got the significantly superior 2-for-1 Jesus Christ, the king and high priest with a superpower, because he was also the Son of God, the only one who with a single act atoned for all the sin. He was the only sacrifice we need.
Now back to our story in Ezra chapter 3, continuing in verse 4. Then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the Festival of Tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, and the sacrifices for all the appointed sacred festivals of the Lord, as well as those brought as freewill offerings to the Lord. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid.
So far, this group of returned exiles is killing it, except for a small mention in there that Heather read of their fear of those living around them. So for a people, a whole generation removed from ever having lived in Jerusalem, because remember, their parents were exiled, they have not forgotten the commandments for any of the religious ceremonies laid out by Moses, even to the point of starting everything on that all-important number 7. For more on that, listen to the whole story of the books of Exodus season 2 and Deuteronomy season 5. You can also check out the chart of festivals and feasts and the chart on types of offerings, which we will put in the show notes. Scene 2, the rebuild of the temple begins with the foundation.
Verse 7, then they gave money to the masons and carpenters and gave food and drink and olive oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so that they would bring cedar logs by sea from Lebanon to Joppa, as authorized by Cyrus, king of Persia. In the 2nd month of the 2nd year after their arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jozadak, and the rest of the people, the priests and the Levites, and all who had returned from the captivity to Jerusalem, began the work.
So the temple was built twice in totality. The first time the temple was built, Solomon built it. This rebuild is the second time. Now, the temple we read about in the New Testament was this same temple, but renovated and expanded version built by Herod. This second temple was an attempt to build the temple as Solomon had built the first temple, with resources from Sidon and Tyre. The timing of the building was also purposeful and mimicked that first temple. The building began in the 2nd month of the new year following the Passover. The Passover was a reminder of God's deliverance from the first captivity in Egypt. Now they are celebrating another deliverance, this time from Babylon. Their sin had exiled them to Babylon, and God's faithfulness had brought them back.
Continuing in verse 8, they appointed Levites 20 years old and older to supervise the building of the house of the Lord, Joshua and his sons and brothers, and Kadmiel and his sons, descendants of Hodaviah, and the sons of Henadad and their sons and brothers, all Levites, joined together in supervising those working on the house of God. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments and with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their places to praise the Lord as prescribed by David, king of Israel. With praise and thanksgiving, they sang to the Lord. He is good. His love toward Israel endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away.
The completion of the foundation was huge, and the people celebrated with praise and thanks, which we would expect. But there were some mixed emotions. It would have been pure joy for the younger generation because we can assume most of the labor was done by them. And these massive blocks that were needed for the foundation were about 5 by 6 feet and would have weighed about 5,000 pounds each. Stones that they would have had to labor to place. And while Solomon would have had scores of laborers, these exiles were few and most likely lacked the skill of the prior builders. So when they finished, they probably felt really good.
Well, they probably felt really sore for carrying 5,000 pounds of things.
But they probably felt good. We did it. Look, we did it. And they're younger. They never saw the old temple. But for the older generation, there was some weeping. They remembered the glory of Solomon's temple. And this one, built among the ruins of what was, could not compare. For them, it was a bittersweet moment, and they wept. So what became of the second temple? This one that we're reading about right now. Well, the second temple was completely destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. Jesus prophesied in Matthew 24 that not one stone will be left. And that is exactly what happened. Today, the Temple Mount, where it once stood, is covered by the Dome of the Rock, which was built in 692 AD. We covered a lot about the Dome of the Rock and this important religious site in season 14, episode 1, in the first episode of 2 Chronicles. In that episode, there were lots of great show notes on the domes and even some videos. If you'd like to check them out, we will also include them in the show notes for this episode. Now, the complete destruction in 70 AD means that there has not been a Jewish temple for worship for nearly 2,000 years. So what does that mean for Christians? Once again, it is the Apostle Paul who explains it best.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, starting in verse 10, by the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should build with care, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If anyone builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, their work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. If it is burned up, the builder will suffer loss, but yet will be saved, even though only as one escaping through the flames. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person, for God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple.
For us, the need for a physical temple was replaced by Christ. Christ is the foundation. The church is the temple. We are the church. Therefore, we are collectively and individually God's temple. And the word of God is how we build the temple, the church, and our faith. And you can't build it on anything else. Questions for us to consider are, what is the condition of your temple? Does it need a total rebuild? Perhaps yours needs some foundation work. Or is it feeling kind of small? Perhaps you need to invest in expanding it. Or is your temple radiating with the golden glow that glorifies the Lord?
Things to ponder.
Exactly. Scene 3, the neighbors oppose the temple rebuild. In chapters 4, 5, and 6, there's going to be 3 rounds of opposition. We're not going to cover them all today. And then next episode too. And just to confuse you, they're not in chronological order. Now, all of these attacks will be from outsiders. Then in chapters 7 through 10, the opposition will start to become internal struggles. The point is, there will always be opposition. There was, is, and always will be opposition in this world, but not in the next. Opposition will die in the end, so hold out for that hope. The books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are all lessons on opposition, and that's probably why I love them. In many of the books prior to this, opposition took the form of dramatic military battles where God parted seas, dropped walls, and blinded the enemy. In contrast, the opposition in these books is sneakier stuff, like political backstabbing, bureaucratic roadblocks, and lots of social and economic pressure tactics.
All things some of us deal with today.
Exactly. Israel was no longer an independent nation that could rely on military might. They were a vulnerable minority group and had to lean hard on their faith and divine help to survive and rebuild. Therefore, they had to learn to be politically smart, stay faithful, and trust that God would deliver behind the scenes.
Just like we do today, which is probably why I love these three books so much.
I know. It's stuff we can use. This is round 1 of the opposition.
Ezra chapter 4. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build, because, like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here."
So the first verse says, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin. So who are these enemies? Years before, when many of the Israelites in the northern kingdom were exiled, foreigners moved in and occupied towns in Samaria. Samaria was in the northern kingdom, remember, which was only about 35 miles north of Jerusalem. Some of the Israelites who escaped the exile had intermarried with these foreigners, creating a kind of hybrid culture and religion that opposed God. The Israelite versus Samaritan rivalry continues into the New Testament. Hence the stories of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10 and the woman at the well in John 4. These neighboring Samaritan enemies opposed the idea of the temple being built. Recall that the Israelites of the northern kingdom had stopped worshiping at the temple when the kingdom split. So they were kind of out of the temple culture even before they were exiled. Add that to the fact that they mixed it up with other religions, and it's not surprising that they are against the temple project and all things related to God.
Verse 3. But Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the peoples of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia.
Zerubbabel and Joshua give them the stiff arm because enemies never really help. They may offer, but they're hiding a covert motive. And more often than not, they lie. As in this case, because the neighbors insist that they have been sacrificing to God all along, as Heather read in 4:2.
Sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here.
That is such a lie. Our first lesson on lying enemies was in Genesis 3. The serpent, more crafty than the other animals, appeared to want to help Eve. He led her down a path of lies, and Eve fell for it, to the detriment of all. Zerubbabel and Joshua recognize their evil intent and refuse. The surrounding enemies of Judah are put out, and they are not going to give up. They try to intimidate the exiles from building. They bribe officials to work against them. This opposition goes on for years, from the time of King Cyrus to the reign of Darius. How did Zerubbabel and Joshua recognize their evil intent? How can we know when something is not of the Lord, but against it? Lessons on enemies. First and foremost, enemies don't self-identify. Therefore, you must study their profile and actions. The Samaritans were not believers. They were lying. The serpent twisted Eve's words. He was lying. Once you identify, know that enemies who offer to help have an ulterior motive. Therefore, reject them definitively, then brace yourself because if rejected, enemies may invite you to compromise. Therefore, you must clearly know your objective and stick to it. The serpent was really good at leading Eve off her objective and used questions like, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The Israelites were sent into captivity because they were led astray by their neighbors, by the promises of false gods that compromised their faith. When all else fails, enemies resort to psychological warfare, and they may accuse you of past sins, hoping self-doubt will stop you. Therefore, you must remember you are forgiven and a new creature in Christ.
And that's why it's so important to A, know what the Bible says so that when you hear it, you can identify it, and B, know who you are in Jesus and have the confidence that comes with that.
Yes, and study the enemy because there's nothing new under the sun. Whether it was Eve or these neighbors, these Samaritans, same tactics over and over again.
And if you miss it, no judgment, just get yourself back on the right path.
Exactly. For the returned exiles, the opposition was devastating. Discouragement set in, and with it delays. From the reign of Cyrus to Darius, the people faltered. The principle for us to remember here is that nothing that is attempted for God will go unchallenged by the enemy. Therefore, we must be aware of anything or anyone who might hinder our faith. Some questions for us to ponder are, what form of enemy are you most susceptible to? Is there anyone who is in opposition to the growth in your temple or faith? What are you attempting that the enemy is attempting to thwart? How good are you at handling opposition in a Christ-like way? What can you do to be better at it? And lastly, we are living in an increasingly anxious world. Christ brought peace and perspective in his approach to opposition. Into what conversations do you believe we as Christians can do the same, thereby building the body and the human temple today? Scene 4, political opposition from the neighbors. In this scene, it's many years later during the time of King Xerxes and Artaxerxes.
And this is where, like you were talking about a few minutes ago, it's all out of order. And if we didn't have you to keep us on track, we'd be pretty confused.
Well, we know from Chronicles that Ezra sometimes goes on a sidetrack in his history, which we can't blame him. He covers a lot of history. This is one of those times where he gets a little off track. Now, these attacks by the same pesky surrounding neighbors would have occurred during the time of Esther and Nehemiah.
Verse 6. At the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, they lodged an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem.
Remember, Xerxes was the king Esther married.
And in the days of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabiel, and the rest of his associates wrote a letter to Artaxerxes. The letter was written in Aramaic script and in the Aramaic language.
Artaxerxes was the king in Nehemiah's story.
Rehum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes the king as follows. Rehum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, together with the rest of their associates, the judges, officials, and administrators over the people from Persia, Uruk, and Babylon, the Elamites of Susa, and the other people whom the great and honorable Ashurbanipal deported and settled in the city of Samaria and elsewhere in Trans-Euphrates. This is a copy of the letter they sent him. To King Artaxerxes, from your servants in Trans-Euphrates. The king should know that the people who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. Furthermore, the king should know that if this city is built and its walls are restored, no more taxes, tribute or duty will be paid, and eventually the royal revenues will suffer. Now, since we are under obligation to the palace and it is not proper for us to see the king dishonored, we are sending this message to inform the king so that a search may be made in the archives of your predecessors. In these records, you will find that this city is a rebellious city, troublesome to kings and provinces, a place with a long history of sedition. That is why this city was destroyed. We inform the king that if this city is built and its walls are restored, you will be left with nothing in Trans-Euphrates.
Rehum and the rest of the regional peeps write a letter that accuses the returned Jews of rebuilding the former wicked city of Jerusalem. Their main proof is the rebuilding of the walls. Walls were built around a city to defend it from other people. Defense implies rebellion against Persia and against their taxation. Now, Rehum is very cunning, and after laying out the problem, he adds fuel to the fire by pointing out that Judah had done this before. The king could search for himself. It's all in the records, he says.
Verse 17, the king sent this reply to Rehum, the commanding officer, Shimshai, the secretary, and the rest of their associates living in Samaria and elsewhere in Trans-Euphrates. Greetings. The letter you sent to us has been read and translated in my presence. I issued an order and a search was made, and it was found that this city has a long history of revolt against kings and has been a place of rebellion and sedition. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole of Trans-Euphrates, and taxes, tribute, and duty were paid to them. Now issue an order to these men to stop work, so that this city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interests? As soon as the copy of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read to Rehum and Shimshai, the secretary, and their associates, they went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop.
Well, of course, Judah had had many powerful kings. David, Solomon, and others had once made sure that Judah was the powerhouse of the land. The result was that the work on the building stopped for 16 years until Nehemiah heard about the disrepair and set the exact same king straight with the providential help of God. In the very next verse, Ezra leaves his reminiscing about the opposition throughout the years and brings us back to his original time period before Xerxes and Artaxerxes. In other words, back to the first round of opposition we left behind back in verse 5, the one where the neighbors put up a fight.
Verse 24, thus the work of the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia.
There are a lot of life lessons here for the opposition we face today. First, we must remember that a delay in the world is not a denial from God. So fight hard against discouragement and pursue patience. Be still and give God time to reveal what he is doing behind the scenes, because that's what this whole story is about. God moving behind the scenes. Second, watch out for distractions. The opposition loves to lead us astray. Pray for clarity and the eyes to see when you are getting sidetracked. Well, the Israelites suffered a delay, but in our next episode, they will persevere and faithfully complete the temple, despite even more opposition.
One of my personal Bible benders is how every book builds on the ones before. So if you're new here or you just skipped ahead, go back and listen to some of the previous seasons of Bible Book Club. You will find Bible benders too. And if you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you and all your friends can listen and discuss. New episodes drop every Monday.